At the height of the crisis, Tom Burridge and his team travelled with the Ukrainian military to one of the most volatile parts of the front line, on the edge of the town of Avdiivka. He sent us this report.
Venture into this industrial area, known as the Prom Zone, on the edge of a small Ukrainian city. And this is the reality almost every night.
That's great. Very close. Go towards that wall. Go towards that wall.
Okay, so we've literally just arrived in what's called the Prom Zone.
Tom Burridge sent this report from the front line of the conflict.
A wait for food, part of their perpetual nightmare of war. But for thousands, the city of Avdiivka is still their home. It's now the epicenter of the worst fighting in eastern Ukraine in 2 years. She says she sits at home trembling when the nighttime routine of heavy shelling begins. We met Valentina. Still in shock, her daughter was killed in the shelling last night. She still hadn't told her 9-year-old grandson.
The child still doesn't know his mother has gone, and I don't know how to tell him.
Who was firing, asked the dead woman's cousin. Who is responsible for eastern Ukraine being covered in blood? Russia's security agency, the FSB, claims hidden explosives in its video here were intended for targets in Crimea. Ukraine says the whole story is a fake. This FSB video shows one of the accused, Yevgeny Panov.
It's too official language, too official.
The way he talks.
Yeah.
His brother believes he's talking under duress and shows signs of torture in another FSB film, in which he makes an apparent confession.
His face is swollen.
Yes, face is very swollen, yes.
And his lips.
Mr. Panov did serve until last August in Ukraine's war in the east of the country. But until he went missing a few days ago, he was a minibus driver at a power plant. His brother thinks he was abducted and says the idea that he was in a special forces team sneaking into Crimea is preposterous.
The reality is most of the civilians living in this city, just a short distance from the front line in that direction, you can hear the fighting now, have nowhere else to go. They're stuck here, stuck in the madness of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Okay, so we're changing positions now.
Our walk through the industrial zone feels like it will never end.
The soldier we're with chooses to walk, but I'd prefer to run right now. Just right out in the open. We made it.
Well, Tom Burridge joins us now from Kharkiv. Tom, let's talk about the attempt to get to the MH17 crash site. Another attempt and another failure.
Sure, clear frustration, I think, for the international monitors going with those Dutch forensic experts trying to reach the crash site, that large area of countryside to the east of Donetsk, for a fourth day running and being turned back on one of the main roads there because of the fighting. We believe they were turned back at a rebel-controlled checkpoint this time around. But of course, the fighting between Ukrainian government forces and the rebels in that area continues. We believe that the Ukrainian army has gained some ground around the crash site, but still not clear who controls it. This impressive network of trenches speaks of how Ukraine has been digging in for months. The country hasn't lost territory to the rebels in well over a year. But these instructors have arrived now. They've been working for a few days with Ukrainian troops, training them in first aid and defensive military tactics. And that tallies with the fact that the West in general has only supplied non-lethal military aid to the Ukrainian army. Things like sleeping bags, laptops, GPS systems. The US is providing radar and surveillance drones. In Avdiivka, the frontline town held by Ukraine, we meet Victor. His wife was killed and his grandson disabled, both by shelling.
You can hear in the background that there's a heavy battle not far from here. We can hear a lot of outgoing firing from the Ukrainian side. And in 2 years of covering this conflict, I've rarely known the situation to be this unstable and volatile. So we've come into Avdiivka, this small city, and you can see the coking plant there. Coke is a material used in the process of making steel. It's a huge feature of this small city, right close to the front line. And what's striking is when you come into Avdiivka, you can hear the artillery, you can hear the mortars there going off in the background, down towards the industrial zone, which is right next to the front line, essentially the front line between Ukrainian military on this side and Russian-backed separatists on the other. What's striking here in Avdiivka, though, is the signs of everyday life. A large group of women just waiting for the bus.
Fighting these Ukrainian troops is a militia which controls two tiny, unrecognized Russian-backed republics. 21-year-old Dima says he will die for land which he says is part of Ukraine.
Зубами хлопці тримають, і вони його дадуть нікому. Це наша земля.
So we've come up to the far end of Avdiivka. We're not far from the prom zone. It's an industrial area just on the edge of the city. You can see these flats here have been shelled in the past, but there's a lot of Ukrainian soldiers here. They're much more busy than they have been when I've been in the conflict zone in the past. There's a lot more activity going on, a lot more military vehicles. You can actually see the OSCE here. That's the international monitors which have been monitoring the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And they're in the area trying to sort of basically keep a tabs on the fighting. You can see in the background, though, residents, again, local residents coming out of their flats. People live in this area, and this is a daily reality for them, although the last 2 or 3 days have been much, much worse than usual.
From the border, here's the BBC's Tom Burridge.
This is how a summer holiday here starts or ends. This is not an international border for much of the world. Everyone here is Ukrainian. Their homes, hotels or family on the other side in Russian-controlled Crimea.